In 1969, an NVA signals officer named Duong sat at a workbench in a hidden facility. A captured American radio sat in front of him. He expected to find a secret. His unit had made the capture 2 days earlier from an ambushed patrol. Word of it had traveled up the chain quickly. Everyone understood what an intact American radio might contain. This was the machine that had directed artillery onto his comrades. It had called down airstrikes with terrifying precision. It had kept an entire American war effort synchronized across a battlefield too vast for any one man to see. Duong had orders to strip it down, understand it, and find whatever secret let it work. He found no secret. That was the discovery, and it took him most of the first day to accept it. The radio was simple. It was a compact transceiver, easy to operate, without the scrambling or encryption equipment his side's own briefings had warned him to expect. It transmitted in the clear. Anyone with the right receiver and enough patience could hear every word, unscrambled in plain language. He turned the machine over in his hands, checked it twice, certain he was missing some hidden component. There was nothing hidden. The Americans were, by simple design choice, broadcasting their war to anyone who cared to listen. Then Duong found the thing that actually mattered. It was not inside the radio at all. Taped to the outside of the case, worn soft from a soldier's hands, was a small card covered in handwriting. Call signs, frequencies, a simplified code for map coordinates. Everything a man would need to make sense of what the radio was saying, kept close because memorizing it under fire was too much to ask of anyone. Duong understood, holding that scrap of paper, that he was looking at the real weakness in the American communication system. It had nothing to do with technology. The machine was honest. The soldier carrying it, exhausted and human, had made a decision that made perfect sense in the field and turned out to be a gift to every man like Duong sitting in a hidden room listening. That is the story of what NVA signals intelligence really found inside a captured American radio. Now let me show you why the answer surprised them. If a story like this matters to you, if the men who lived it on both sides deserve to be remembered, a like and a subscribe help it reach the people who care. It takes 1 second. These are the stories the history books leave out. Now, to understand why a captured radio taught the NVA more about the war than any single battle could, you first have to understand exactly what that radio was and what it was not. To understand what Duong found and did not find, you have to understand the machine itself and the deliberate choices that shaped what it could and could not do. The radio was the AN/PRC-25, known throughout the American ranks by the blunt nickname, the acronym Invited. It became the most widely used field radio of the entire war. Infantry units carried it at every level. It was mounted in vehicles strapped to the backs of forward observers and radio operators across the country. It was compact and solid state, built to be as close to foolproof as combat electronics could be. A soldier needed only to select a frequency, choose a power setting, connect an antenna, and he was on the air. It was engineered for the conditions it would actually face: heat, mud, rain, the constant abuse of jungle warfare. It largely succeeded. Among the men who carried it, it earned a reputation as remarkably reliable, almost impossible to break through ordinary field use. That very simplicity was also the radio's defining limitation. It is the single fact that made Duong's discovery possible. The PRC-25 offered no voice encryption of any kind. It could not scramble a conversation. It had no equipment built into it capable of doing so. This was not an oversight. It reflected a deliberate trade-off made at the design stage. Encryption equipment of that era was heavy, complex, and prone to failure in exactly the harsh conditions the PRC-25 was built to survive. A radio that could talk securely, using the technology available at the time, was heavier, more fragile, harder to operate under fire. The designers chose reliability and simplicity over security. For years, American forces operated on the assumption that this trade-off was acceptable, because they did not believe the enemy had the sophistication to meaningfully exploit it. Picture the actual room where a choice like that gets made because it was not careless. A designer weighs two versions of the same radio side by side. One is heavier, more complex, harder to repair in the field, but secure. The other is light, simple, nearly indestructible, but broadcasts every word in the clear. In a war where a radio has to survive being dropped in a river, caked in mud, operated by an exhausted 18-year-old with no technical training, the simple version wins the argument almost every time. The choice was rational. It was also, as it turned out, a bet against an enemy the designers had badly underestimated. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Every conversation carried on a PRC-25, unless a unit had rare and cumbersome separate encryption equipment, traveled through the air exactly as spoken. Call signs, coordinates, plans, casualty reports, all of it available to anyone within range who knew how to listen. The radio was not broken. It was doing precisely what it had been designed to do. The vulnerability was not a flaw in the machine. It was a choice made deliberately that assumed an enemy too primitive to take advantage of it. When Duong finally accepted the radio held no hidden secret, he turned to what the machine could actually teach him. The answer reshaped how his side approached the whole electronic dimension of that war. The first thing the radio confirmed was something American commanders had been repeatedly warned about and had been slow to believe. Signals intelligence specialists inside the American military had cautioned for years that the enemy possessed a genuine and growing capacity to intercept radio traffic. Those warnings were treated with real skepticism by many field commanders. They assumed an insurgent force fighting largely out of the jungle could not maintain the kind of technical listening capability that would make American radio traffic genuinely useful to them. The capture of intact enemy signals intelligence material in 1969 from a unit American reports referred to by the designation Alpha 3 forced a reckoning with that assumption. What was recovered confirmed in undeniable terms that the enemy had built exactly the listening capability the warnings described. Picture what that discovery looked like to the American officers examining the material. Logs, frequency charts, records of intercepted call signs, matched patiently over months to specific American units. This was not a lucky guess. It was a functioning, disciplined intelligence operation built quietly over years by an enemy most commanders had assumed incapable of anything so systematic. Picture the meeting where that material was finally presented to senior American officers, because the moment mattered enormously. For years, signals officers had filed warnings that went largely unheeded, treated as the kind of cautious, worst-case thinking that specialists are paid to produce and generalists are paid to discount. Now those same officers stood in a room with physical proof spread across a table, logbooks, frequency charts, translated notes matching specific American call signs to specific American units over specific months. The reaction in that room was not triumph. It was closer to a slow sinking recalculation, the particular discomfort of realizing that a risk dismissed for years as theoretical had, in fact, been real and active the entire time, quietly costing American lives in ways nobody had been able to prove until that exact table, that exact stack of captured paper. The captured radio, examined from the other direction, told Duong's side something equally important. It told them precisely what their own listening post needed to be tuned for, and precisely how easy the target actually was, because the PRC-25 transmitted in the clear on frequencies that followed patterns his side could study. A well-positioned listening operation did not need to break any code at all. It needed only to find the right frequency at the right time and listen to a conversation being conducted as though no one else in the world could hear it. This is a very different intelligence problem than code breaking. In some ways, it is a far easier one to solve, given patient operators and the right equipment. And that equipment requirement is where the more remarkable part of this story lives, because what Duong's side had was not, on paper, especially impressive. What made the difference was ingenuity applied to a specific problem. NVA and Viet Cong technical personnel developed their own antenna designs, engineered to improve on the standard equipment. This let listening posts operate from much greater distances than a comparable American antenna would allow, while being far easier to conceal from aerial observation. A listening operation did not need to sit dangerously close to American positions. It could operate from a safe distance, hidden, patient, picking up conversations the men speaking them believed were private. Picture what one of these improvised listening posts actually looked like, tucked into a hillside well beyond the range anyone would have suspected. A length of carefully strung wire, disguised among the natural vegetation, running to a receiver hidden in a covered pit. An operator sitting for hours at a time, headphones on, a notebook open, patiently logging every fragment of American radio traffic that drifted across the frequency he had been assigned to monitor that day. There was nothing dramatic about the scene. It looked, to anyone who might have stumbled across it, like almost nothing at all, which was, of course, the entire point. The genius of the setup was not in any single piece of equipment. It was in the discipline of making an intelligence operation look like empty hillside for months at a time, while it quietly did its work. Now return to the detail that mattered most on Duong's workbench. The small taped card told him more than the machine itself ever could, because it revealed the actual human shape of the vulnerability his side had been exploiting. The radio's lack of encryption meant anyone listening could hear the words spoken over it. Picture the specific moment Duong actually noticed the card, because it happened almost by accident. He had already spent hours with the radio itself, opening its casing, tracing its circuits, satisfying himself that there was truly nothing hidden inside. He set it down on the workbench, frustrated, and it was only then, turning it to check the underside, that his fingers caught the edge of tape along the case. He almost dismissed it as packaging residue. Then he peeled it back and found the card beneath, and the frustration of the entire day reorganized itself instantly into something closer to excitement. He had been looking in the wrong place the whole time. The machine had told him nothing. The tape told him everything. But raw words alone were not always immediately useful. Call signs needed to be matched to units. Coordinates needed to be understood in the context of whatever simplified reference system a unit was using that day. Since units frequently used coded map references rather than plain grid coordinates, change periodically to slow down exactly this kind of interception. All of this, call signs, current frequencies, the day's coded reference system, was compiled into what American units called signal operating instructions. It was meant to be memorized or, at minimum, kept secure and destroyed rather than risk capture. In practice, memorizing this under the actual conditions of jungle warfare was an unreasonable expectation. Every soldier who carried a radio understood this instinctively, whatever the official policy demanded. A radio operator in the middle of a firefight, exhausted, frightened, on almost no sleep, could not be relied upon to recall a lengthy set of codes purely from memory at the exact moment they were needed most. So a common and understandable practice developed across many units. Write the essential information down in compact and simplified form and keep it physically close to the radio, sometimes taped directly to the case, so a glance was all it took to confirm a call sign under pressure. Picture the actual moment that decision gets made, because it happens quietly, without anyone framing it as a security choice at all. A young radio man, weeks into his tour, forgets a call sign in the middle of a chaotic transmission and has to ask for it to be repeated while rounds crack overhead. It is a small, survivable mistake, but it costs seconds that feel much longer, and it frightens him in a way that stays with him. That night, or the next, he writes the day's codes on a scrap of paper, in whatever shorthand makes sense to him, and tapes it where his eyes will find it instantly. He does not think of this as compromising anything. He thinks of it as making sure he never has that same terrible pause again. Multiply that private decision across thousands of radios in thousands of units over years, and you have exactly the vulnerability Duong was holding in his hands. This was, from a strictly technical standpoint, a serious compromise. It was exactly the kind that signals intelligence training warned against. And it was also, from the standpoint of an ordinary young man trying to keep himself and his unit alive, an entirely rational decision. The gap between what security doctrine demanded and what a frightened, exhausted soldier could actually be expected to do under fire was where Duong's real discovery lived. He was not looking at a technological failure. He was looking at the predictable human result of asking an impossible amount of a person operating under genuine mortal danger. And when a radio like this one was captured intact, with its taped reference card still attached, it did not simply confirm what had already been learned through intercepted transmissions alone. It handed over the key that made every future intercepted transmission from that unit until its codes changed instantly and completely legible. Weeks of patient listening became an open book in a single afternoon. Think about the practical effect of that shift for the listening post that had been struggling with the specific unit's traffic for weeks. Before the capture, an operator might catch a call sign, a coordinate, a fragment of a plan, and have to guess, imperfectly, at what it actually meant, building up an incomplete picture through slow accumulation and educated inference. After the capture, with the taped card in hand, the same traffic became transparent in real time. A coordinate that once required careful cross-referencing against captured maps and previous intercepts could now be read directly off the card, translated instantly, understood the moment it was spoken. The difference was not incremental. It was the difference between reading a language slowly, word by word, with a dictionary, and simply understanding it fluently the instant it was spoken. Understanding what the enemy could learn from a captured radio explains something else about that war that deserves to be said plainly. It shaped one of the most dangerous jobs any American soldier could hold. Once it became clear on both sides how valuable a functioning American radio and its documentation actually was, the men who carried radios in the field became specific, deliberate, priority targets. This was not incidental to combat, it was calculated. An enemy force engaging an American unit understood that eliminating the radio operator accomplished two things at once. It severed that unit's ability to call for artillery, air support, or reinforcement in the middle of a fight. And if the radio and its papers could be recovered intact, rather than destroyed in the fighting, it delivered a second, longer-lasting prize. A working window into that unit's communications for as long as the compromised codes remained in use. This meant carrying a radio in the field was never simply a logistical assignment. It made a man measurably more dangerous to be near. Radio operators developed their own quiet body of tradecraft in response, much of it never written into any official manual, learned instead from other operators who had survived contact. Some kept the antenna as inconspicuous as possible, avoiding the taller, more visible, long-range antenna, except when its extra range was genuinely necessary because a distinctive silhouette made a man easy to pick out. Some deliberately positioned themselves slightly apart from the officers they supported, so an enemy scanning a patrol for the two men most worth killing could not identify both at a glance. Picture the specific discipline this demanded of a young man carrying 30 pounds of radio equipment through the jungle, on top of everything else he already carried. He learns to walk a few paces from his lieutenant rather than beside him, close enough to relay orders instantly, far enough that the two of them do not read as an obvious pair to anyone watching. He learns to keep the whip antenna folded down whenever range allows, even though the long antenna would make his own job easier because it is exactly the kind of silhouette an enemy gunner is trained to look for first. None of this is written in any handbook he was issued. It is knowledge passed man to man, learned from the ones who lived through contact and understood, afterward, exactly which small habit had kept them alive. And every operator understood, with a clarity that shaped how he behaved in the worst moments of a firefight, that the radio and its papers could not simply be dropped if his position was being overrun. Picture the specific moment this played out, because it was not a hypothetical fear for these men. It happened again and again, in exactly the shape their training had warned them about. An ambush opens, and within the first seconds, before most of the patrol has even located the source of the fire, a burst comes in aimed with unusual precision at the man carrying the whip antenna. He goes down, or the man beside him does, and the survivors understand instantly what has happened. The enemy did not open fire randomly and get lucky. They identified the radio operator specifically in the opening seconds of contact and prioritized him over every other target in the patrol, exactly as the tradecraft past man-to-man had always warned would happen. The lesson was not academic for the men who watched it happen to someone they knew. It was the reason they adjusted their own antenna discipline, their own spacing from their officers, the very next time they went into the field. Standard practice called for destroying the equipment rather than allowing it to fall into enemy hands intact. This created one of the grimmer calculations a man in that position sometimes had to make, whether there was time in the seconds available to render the equipment useless before saving himself. The North Vietnamese even reused the radio's discarded batteries and booby traps, a practice significant enough that American units were specifically ordered to destroy spent batteries. That tells you something about how thoroughly this equipment and everything attached to it was treated as valuable salvage by an enemy who wasted nothing. It would be incomplete to tell this story only from the perspective of the vulnerability being exploited. The Americans, once the scale of the problem became undeniable, adapted in ways that deserve their own honest accounting. The 1969 confirmation of the enemy's genuine signals intelligence capability triggered real, if uneven, changes in how American forces approached radio security. Training in proper communications discipline intensified across many units. It emphasized shorter transmissions, more careful use of call signs, and greater caution about exactly the kind of taped reference cards that had made Duong's discovery so useful. Some units received the newer PRC-25, which, unlike its predecessor, could be paired with dedicated voice encryption equipment. This gave at least some communications genuine security against exactly the interception methods the enemy had proven capable of. This was real, meaningful progress, and it closed off some of the easiest exploitation opportunities. Picture what receiving that new equipment actually looked like for an ordinary radio operator in the field, because the improvement came with its own real costs. A crate arrives at a fire base, and inside it is the new radio along with a separate heavy box of encryption equipment that has to be carried, powered, and operated correctly, on top of everything the operator already carried. The training that accompanied it was often rushed, delivered in the field by men who had themselves only recently learned the new procedures, and the equipment itself, however genuine an improvement over nothing, was fussier and more failure-prone than the simple radio it was meant to secure. Some operators embraced it fully. Others, under the pressure of an actual firefight, found themselves reaching for the plain, familiar radio procedure they had used for months, because the secure system, however important, was one more thing that could go wrong at exactly the wrong moment, and a man under fire reaches first for what he trusts. But the honest reckoning has to include how partial and how slow this progress actually was. The encryption equipment available, even once fielded, was heavy, complicated to operate correctly under field conditions, and never issued widely enough to secure the vast majority of tactical radio traffic across the entire war. Most units for most of the conflict continued operating largely as they always had, transmitting in the clear over the same basic technology, relying on the same imperfect human systems of call signs and coded references that had proven so exploitable from the start. Training and awareness improved. The fundamental technical vulnerability and the fundamental human pressures that produced things like taped reference cards never fully went away because they were built into the basic trade-off the radio itself represented. Picture what it actually looked like to try to fix this problem at the scale the war required. Thousands of radios already in the field. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, most rotating through a one-year tour, needing to be retrained faster than the training could realistically be delivered. New encryption equipment that had to be manufactured, shipped, distributed, and taught, all while the war continued at full intensity around the men trying to implement the fix. It was less like flipping a switch and more like trying to change a wheel on a truck that could not stop moving. Real progress happened. It happened slowly, unevenly, and never completely, because the war itself never paused long enough to let the fix catch up to the problem. This is worth sitting with, honestly, because it complicates any simple story of enemy cleverness triumphing over American carelessness. The vulnerability Duong found was not primarily a failure of discipline, though lapses in discipline made it worse. It was the predictable consequence of a real and reasonable engineering trade-off, made under real constraints that assumed a threat the American command structure did not initially believe was credible. Once that assumption was proven wrong, with captured evidence that could not be argued away, the response was genuine but structurally limited by the same practical realities that had shaped the original design choice. Duong spent the rest of the war working in the same quiet, technical corner of the conflict. In the years afterward, he thought often about that afternoon at the workbench and about what the radio had actually taught him. He came to understand that his first assumption, walking into that room expecting a hidden secret, had been wrong in an instructive way. He had expected the machine to be the enemy's cleverness, encoded into steel and circuitry, something that would need to be defeated through equally sophisticated engineering of his own. What he found instead was an enemy who had made a deliberate, reasonable choice to prioritize reliability over secrecy on the correct assumption at the time that the alternative was too heavy and too fragile for the war they intended to fight. The vulnerability had never been a mistake in the ordinary sense. It had been a bet, made honestly, that turned out to be wrong once the actual conditions of the war revealed how patient and resourceful the other side could be. He thought, too, about the taped card and what it told him about the actual human texture of the enemy he was fighting. He had been trained to think of the Americans as an impersonal, overwhelming machine defined by equipment and firepower, rather than by anything as small as one exhausted soldier's decision to write his own notes rather than risk forgetting them under fire. That small human compromise, repeated across thousands of radios and thousands of units, had done more to open the American communication system to his side's listening posts than any single piece of technology ever could. He came to understand this as a universal truth about any complicated system built by human beings. The theoretical security of a system and the practical security of a system are rarely the same thing. The gap between them is always filled by ordinary people making reasonable decisions under pressure no policy document ever fully anticipates. He remembered, too, that his own side's radio traffic had been vulnerable to something similar in its own way, though the specific mechanism was different. Every army in that war, on every side, was staffed by exhausted, frightened human beings trying to do an impossible job with imperfect tools. Every one of those armies discovered sooner or later that its own soldiers had quietly compensated for demands that policy had never made reasonable in the first place. Duong did not think of this as a weakness unique to the Americans. He came to think of it as a fact about war itself, true on both sides of every line ever drawn on a map. He carried this understanding into the training he later gave to younger signals officers, and he found himself repeating a version of the same lesson to each new group. Do not look only at the machine, he told them. Look at the man who has to use it, exhausted at 3 a.m, with his life depending on getting it right in a few seconds. Whatever shortcut that man takes to make his impossible job survivable, that is where you will find your answer, not in the wiring diagram. Some of the younger officers found this advice frustratingly vague at first, trained as they were to think of intelligence work as a technical discipline, a matter of frequencies and codes and equipment specifications. Duong understood their frustration because he had felt exactly the same way himself on that first day at the workbench before he had learned to look somewhere else, and he came, eventually, to a complicated respect for the men on the other end of those radios, the ones whose voices he and men like him had listened to for years without ever meeting them. He understood, better than most, exactly how much danger those radio operators had lived in, carrying a piece of equipment that made them a priority target the moment contact began. Trusting a system he knew, better than they ever could, was quietly broken in ways their own command had been slow to admit. He did not think less of them for the taped card he had found. If anything, he understood it as evidence of exactly the same thing he had seen in his own side's soldiers over and over. Ordinary men doing an impossible job as well as they could, making the best decisions available with the information and the time that fear and exhaustion actually allowed. Here is what Duong finally understood, sitting at that workbench with a captured radio in front of him, and why the answer he found mattered more than any secret he had expected. He had gone looking for a machine's weakness and found instead a human one, wearing the machine as its disguise. The radio was not broken. It did exactly what it had been built to do, honestly and reliably, under conditions that would have destroyed more delicate and more secure equipment. Its vulnerability was not a flaw hidden inside its circuits. It was a choice made years earlier by engineers solving a real problem with the tools available to them that assumed an enemy incapable of exploiting the trade-off. That assumption turned out to be the actual weakness, and no amount of examining the machine itself could have revealed it, because the machine was never where the vulnerability actually lived. Picture 2, the scene of the capture itself, because it explains why radios like this one reach men like Duong intact rather than in pieces. An American patrol, caught in a well-prepared ambush, took casualties fast, and in the chaos of a firefight, most equipment gets damaged, dropped, or destroyed before anyone can retrieve it deliberately. Sometimes, though, a radio operator went down early, and the fighting moved past his position before the survivors could reach him, or before anyone thought to destroy what he carried. A sweep of the ambush site afterward might find the radio simply sitting there, undamaged, still on its assigned frequency, the handset resting where the man had dropped it. This was not a triumph of intelligence work. It was the plain, ordinary luck of a battlefield, and it was exactly this kind of ordinary luck, repeated often enough across years of fighting, that fed a steady trickle of intact equipment for men like Duong to study. The taped card told the rest of the story, and it is the part of this discovery that reaches furthest beyond one radio in one war. Every complicated system that depends on human beings to operate it correctly, under pressure, without exception, will eventually meet the gap between what the system demands and what an exhausted, frightened person can actually deliver in the moment that matters most. That gap does not appear because anyone involved is careless or foolish or poorly trained. It appears because the demand itself is, in practice, more than any person can reliably meet every single time for years without a single lapse. Someone eventually finds a way to compensate in whatever small, reasonable, human way keeps the larger job possible. That compensation, repeated often enough across a large enough system, becomes the actual vulnerability, whether or not it was ever written down in any doctrine. Think about how often this exact pattern repeats far beyond one radio in one war. Every security system ever built by human beings has, somewhere inside it, a password written on a sticky note, a door propped open because the keycard reader is inconvenient, a shortcut taken by someone doing their honest best under conditions the designers never fully imagined. The engineers who build these systems are rarely wrong about the technology. They are sometimes wrong about the humans who will eventually have to operate that technology. Tired, frightened, and under pressure the design specifications never accounted for. Duong found that gap once on a workbench in the shape of a taped card. It has existed in one form or another in every complicated system anyone has ever tried to keep secure. Duong sat at that workbench expecting to find the enemy's cleverness, and he found something more useful and far more human instead. The exact place where a reasonable engineering choice met an exhausted soldier's reasonable improvisation, and the two together opened a door neither side had fully intended to leave unlocked. That is what NVA signals intelligence really found inside a captured American radio. Not a secret hidden in the machine. The ordinary, unavoidable humanity of the men who had to use it, written in pencil, taped to the case, exactly where a patient man with a workbench and enough time would eventually think to look. Now you know why. Thank you for staying with the story all the way to the end. These are the histories worth keeping, not just the famous battles with their famous names, but the quiet, technical corners of that war where a single captured object could change everything on both sides of the wire. If it meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these videos find the people who care about them. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time. Hit subscribe and the bell so you never miss a new one. I would love to know where you are watching from today. And if someone in your family served in Vietnam, a radioman, a signals specialist, anyone in any unit, tell me about them in the comments. Every one of those men carried a story like the one you just heard. Most of them never told it. This is how we make sure they are not forgotten.